Welcome to the June 2022 CSAFE webinar sponsored by NIST. Today we have blind testing and firearms examination, preliminary results, benefits, limitations, and future direction. Your speaker today is Madison Newman from the Houston Forensic Science Center. Maddie holds a bachelor's degree from Oregon State University and a master's degree from Louisiana State University. She joined HFSC in 2018, where she currently works as a quality or research associate in collaboration with us here at CSAFE. Part of her responsibilities include working with us to conduct research in latent print examination and assisting the quality division at HFSC with the implementation of the blind quality control program. Maddie's co-authored several articles and presented numerous times on research related to the blind program and the latent print workflow. Maddie, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend my presentation today. Again, my name is Maddie, and I work in the quality division of the Houston Forensic Science Center, where I co-facilitate much of a blind testing program with my colleague, Callan Hundle. And today I'll be sharing with you some preliminary results from our blind program in the firearms section. I am not a firearms examiner, so this won't be a very technical presentation. It will instead be a more quality-oriented presentation. We'll start out with just a little bit of background on the Houston Forensic Science Center. It was founded in 2014 to be independent from law enforcement, specifically the Houston Police Department. We separated from the Houston Police Department Crime Laboratory, but HPD is still our biggest stakeholder. HFSC now operates as a local government corporation overseen by a board of directors, and we currently provide forensic services in 7 technical disciplines: toxicology, latent prints, forensic biology, seized drugs, firearms, multimedia, and a crime scene unit. All sections are accredited to the 17025-2017 standard by ANAB. And the Texas Forensic Science Commission also licenses certain forensic disciplines in the state of Texas. The TFSC licensed disciplines at HFSC are toxicology, seized drugs, biology, and firearms. Many laboratories, HFSC included, participate in open proficiency testing as a way to meet accreditation requirements and demonstrate examiner competence. However, these tests are often limited in the ability to test the entire workflow from evidence submission all the way through to reporting of results. And because of this, blind proficiency testing has been suggested by several scientific bodies. I'm sure you are familiar with them. One of them is the 2009 National Academy of Sciences report, which states that blind proficiency testing is recommended, but not required as a more precise test of a worker's accuracy. A few years later, in 2016, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology published a report that said proficiency testing should ideally be conducted in a test blind manner, such that examiners do not know that they are being tested. And then laboratories accredited to the 17025-2017 standard are familiar with clause 771, which lists intralaboratory comparisons and testing of blind samples as just 2 suggested ways of ensuring the validity of results. So the NAS report, the PCAST report, and of course, the clause 771 are 3 of the main driving forces behind HFSC's blind quality control program. The blind program was implemented in the fall of 2015, starting with the toxicology section. The program has expanded over the years and now includes firearms, seized drugs, latent prints, biology, and multimedia as well, so every technical discipline except for the crime scene unit. We have not yet figured out how to make a blinded mock crime scene, but it's definitely a recurring discussion. The program is facilitated by the quality division, which is organizationally separate from the technical sections. However, we do occasionally have to enlist the help of supervisors or managers with creating mock evidence and helping us to determine ground truth. Submissions consist of mock cases created in-house from scratch. We don't blind our routine proficiency tests, and we don't typically reuse proficiency testing materials, which is why, it's part of the reason why we tend to call our program a blind quality control program and not a blind proficiency testing program. But you're probably more familiar with the term blind proficiency testing. A lot of research and time goes into creating blinded mock cases for each section. The advantage of a blind testing program is having a ground truth against which to compare examination results. And because examiners aren't aware which cases are blind test cases, the cases receive no special treatment and are worked just as real casework. This allows us to have eyes on the whole examination process from evidence submission to the reporting of results. And the general submission goal for each section is based on 5% of the section's case output from the year before. So for 2022, we calculated 5% of casework output for each section for 2021 and used those numbers to set our 2022 submission goals. This number is not based on anything really, other than it's a target goal that is comfortable for the quality division who creates the cases and the sections who work the cases. So neither party wants to be slammed with blind cases when there's obviously real casework to be done. We find this number manageable. So the rest of the presentation is going to focus on the blind program in the firearms section specifically. I'll briefly go over sample preparation and firearms section workflow, present some findings from a recent publication, and discuss limitations, benefits, and future directions for the program. Firearms blind cases are designed and submitted in a manner consistent with the evidence items and offense types that the section observes in routine casework. In order to appear authentic, a variety of samples are submitted. The firearm used to create the fired evidence may or may not also be submitted as an item of evidence. And we're fortunate that we have several sources of firearms to use for creating the mock evidence. HFSC has a fairly large reference collection. However, we can't actually submit the reference collection firearms as an item of evidence because the examiners will recognize those firearms. Even though it is a large reference collection, we've tried and they've recognized them, so that put a stopper in that. We can also use HFSC staff personally owned firearms to create fired evidence. But again, we don't submit these firearms as an item of evidence. They stay with the owners, but we can use them to create a multitude of fired evidence. We do have a really great partnership with the Houston Police Department's Property Room Division, and they actually let us borrow firearms that are on the destroy list. And those are firearms that we can submit as items of evidence in these blind cases. That's great because we can use real used grimy guns that are slightly more representative of the guns being used in real crimes or that the section sees in regular casework. So we're very fortunate to have the property room help us with that. We don't always submit evidence created using one firearm. We can mix up the types of evidence and firearms submitted to create more challenging cases for the examiners. Not all items submitted, such as bullet cores, are intended to be suitable for comparison. We rely on the firearms manager to create the mock evidence for us. When the blind evidence is created, the firearms manager keeps track of which items belong together, either by using a UV pen to mark the items or taking thorough notes in a spreadsheet that lets her distinguish items from each other. The UV pen is great though, because they come in different colors, but they don't show up in the course of normal examination unless the firearms examiner happens to have a black light on their desk, which I hope they don't. So firearms section management evaluates the created evidence prior to submission to determine the expected ground truth, and then again reviews the results of the completed blind cases after examination to determine satisfactory completion. Cartridge casings and bullet jackets are submitted with ground truths of either identification or elimination. Fragments and bullet cores are expected to be unsuitable or insufficient, regardless of which firearm was used to create the evidence. When a case is ready and packaged, just like a real firearms case would be, which is usually in like a manila envelope or a gun box if we are submitting a firearm, we email our evidence technicians who take the evidence to the HPD property room and prepare it with an HPD evidence barcode. And there the evidence will stay until Callan or I make a request for analysis through the request portal. And the request portal is on the left here. It's called Where's My Result? You enter the HPD case number there, hit search, and a variety of options will come up depending on what sort of forensic services you want performed for that case. We enlist the help of a few HPD officers to appear on the request for us, which assists in keeping the case blind. Because if my name was on the request, all the firearms examiners know me, and that would unblind the case before it even hit their desk. So again, HPD really helping us out here. The evidence technicians will then receive the notification from the portal, and on their next property room run, they will pick up the evidence and whatever other evidence they need to pick up. They'll bring it back to the laboratory and prepare it with the appropriate laboratory barcode. And then they'll place it in the firearms evidence staging vault with all the other firearms evidence waiting to be assigned by a supervisor. So at this point, not even the manager or the supervisors know which cases are the blind cases, and they'll get assigned in the same manner as any real case would. Our submission goal for firearms has been 1 per month for the last several years. This is a manageable number for Callan and me to work with the firearms management to meet, to create the cases. These cases are a little more complicated to create than some of the other sections in which we submit blind tests. So yeah, this is just manageable for everybody involved. So the firearms section conducts casework on a request basis from stakeholders, which is what I explained in the last slide. HPD officers have to do the exact same thing that Callan and I do to get these fake cases to the laboratory to be examined. The majority of requests are for microscopic examination and comparison of bullets and cartridge cases to determine if the fired evidence was fired in the same firearm. So that's the type of blind evidence we try to mimic. Items are examined for markings made during the firing process, and conclusions are rendered based on the level of agreement or disagreement of these marks. We'll go over that in a couple of slides. The firearms section also operates a program for the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, or NIBIN. This program is not request-based. Instead, firearms suitable for NIBIN processing are automatically submitted. So any firearm that comes to the laboratory is automatically submitted for NIBIN processing. NIBIN technicians test fire firearms for NIBIN entry, and the bullets and cartridge cases created from the test firing may be used as known samples in casework. HPD has their own independent NIBIN program, and because we are not allowed to have these fake cases entered into NIBIN, we had to find workarounds for both programs. So essentially, we make the cases look like they've gone through NIBIN processing, but they don't actually go through NIBIN processing. So none of our cases are uploaded to NIBIN, but once the case hits the examiner's desk, they can't tell any difference. So I'm going to take a minute just to go over some vocabulary because I had to learn some new vocabulary words when I was embarking on this research project with my colleagues. So just in case anybody is in the same boat and is not familiar with firearms language, I'll go over a few of the main points that are needed to understand the rest of this presentation. So the markings imparted onto fired evidence can be classified into two major groups: individual characteristics and class characteristics. Individual characteristics are marks unique to a firearm which occur beyond the control of the manufacturer. So the marks can be due to ever-changing tool edges and multiple manufacturing techniques used on the same item. Class characteristics, however, are related to the manufacturing process of the firearms. Examples of class characteristics include the number and twist of the lands and grooves, those markings in a barrel, or the shape of the firing pin. Subclass characteristics also exist, and these features may be produced during the manufacture that are consistent among items fabricated by the same tool in the same approximate state of wear. And subclass characteristics are not determined prior to manufacture. The firearms examiners use a set range of conclusions when conducting casework, and these are the conclusions we're looking for when we review the blind cases. This is a very truncated slide, just so that we can understand what language we're using, but based on the AFTI range of conclusions, firearms examiners can conclude identification, elimination, inconclusive, and unsuitable. HFSC firearms can also conclude that something is insufficient for analysis, and insufficient is used to record more information regarding an item and provide more information to the stakeholder should they need to for any reason. Because insufficient and unsuitable are suitability determinations and not comparison conclusions, they're lumped together for the purposes of this presentation. And we'll just focus on identification, elimination, and inconclusive. And very briefly, identifications are made on corresponding individual characteristics, whereas eliminations are made on a disagreement of class characteristics or individual characteristics. And inconclusive can indicate that an item lacks the quality or quantity of characteristics needed to make an identification or elimination conclusion. When HFSC started the blind program, there wasn't really a research objective in mind. The goal was just to get the program up and running. So once the firearms section had worked an appropriate amount of cases, we decided that now was probably a good time to look at the data, see what we find, maybe reassess some of the things that we are doing in the program. So for the purposes of this initial publication that we have, our research objectives were very simple. They were just to describe preliminary results from a blind testing program in firearms examination, one of the few of its kind, examine the prevalence of examiner conclusions and explore the extent to which there are trends in those conclusions, and discuss the benefits the firearms section garners from the blind program, as well as some ideas and future directions that the program could take. So our goal for an appropriate sample size was 50 blind cases. And between December 2015 and June 2021, when we started gathering the data, 51 blind QC cases had been reported. So that's what we used for our study set. 460 items, including test fires created as a part of routine casework, were examined, resulting in 570 sufficiency and comparison conclusions. Because the data was examined at the comparison level, so item to item, an item of evidence can appear in the data set in multiple comparisons and be represented by multiple comparison conclusions. And if that is just clear as mud, I have an example of that later and I'll point it out. The mock evidence items were created with ground truths being 386 identification, 143 elimination, and 29 insufficient or unsuitable. Again, at that item to item comparison level. Now you might realize that those numbers don't add up to 570. That's because we had 12 bullet items that had to be eliminated from the study because ground truth was not able to be redetermined after examination. either because the bullet items weren't marked with the UV pen or the UV pen wore off during the course of examination. And all 12 items were concluded to be inconclusive by the examiners, so we couldn't even use their conclusion to give us an idea of what the ground truth might be. Our firearms manager examined the bullets herself and could not come to a different conclusion, which supported the inconclusive decision of the examiners, but again, left us with 12 items for which we did not have a ground truth. During this study, there were 11 firearms examiners actively participating in casework at HFSC, and their experience ranged from 5.5 to 23 years. 6 examiners were trained by the Houston Police Department prior to the formalization of HFSC, and the remaining examiners were trained by outside agencies before starting work at HFSC. So we'll just take a closer look at some of the numbers that we observed. Again, a total of 558 comparisons were made with ground truths, being identification, elimination, or those insufficient and unsuitable. Again, excluding those 12 bullet items for which we couldn't redetermine ground truth. Approximately 60% of comparisons resulted in the accurate ground truth determination. All fragments and shot pellets were appropriately reported as unsuitable or insufficient. The remaining 40% of comparisons resulted in inconclusive decisions. 119 inconclusive results for those items with ground truth of identification, and 106 inconclusive results for those items with the ground truth of elimination. And we also saw that bullets were more often reported as inconclusive than cartridge cases. So here's that worksheet I was talking about, where you can see that item 1.5 was compared to 3 items, at least on this page of the worksheet. So it's represented multiple times in 3 different comparisons. But then looking closer at the inconclusive results, we found that about 74% of ground truth eliminations resulted in inconclusive responses, whereas only 31% of ground truth identifications resulted in inconclusives. This could be because identifications are generally considered easier to make based on individual characteristics alone. When class characteristics differ, elimination is the appropriate choice by definition. However, when observable class characteristics do agree, again, as seen in the example comparison worksheet on the left with that item 1.5 comparisons, the examiner must consider how variables such as differences in ammunition and condition of the bearing surfaces of the firearm impact the individual characteristics imparted on fired bullets and casings. When an examiner cannot rule out factors that contribute to insufficient agreement of individual characteristics, inconclusive may be the more prudent conclusion, which is what happened in this example here. We found that evidence type contributed to inconclusive determinations, with bullets having a higher inconclusive rate than cartridge cases, 62% of bullets and 22% of cartridge cases. This could be due to several factors. Again, for example, when conducting microscopic comparisons on bullets, there are fewer areas of interest or land impressions at which to look because only one part of the firearm, the barrel, contacts the bullet. Cartridge cases are contacted by more parts of the firearm, thus providing more surfaces and more information with which to make comparison conclusions. Furthermore, groove impressions on bullets are prone to subclass characteristics, which are more restrictive than class characteristics, but less restrictive than individual characteristics. And if subclass cannot be ruled out, the examiner must make an inconclusive determination. 23% of the cases were created using 2 firearms of the same class to make multiple items of evidence. This was done intentionally to make the comparisons more challenging. Inconclusive decisions were made in 86% of comparisons in which the evidence was created using two firearms of the same class, which we did find to be a statistically significant source of inconclusive results. Again, because when class characteristics do agree, the examiner must consider factors that cause disagreement in individual characteristics. And then lastly, we found that inconclusive conclusions did not appear to be related to primary and second examiner pairings, experience level, or training program. Most of the examiners are long-stay examiners and have been working under the same procedures for years, so this was not really surprising to us. So even though we had a 40% inconclusive rate, we ultimately determined that the cases were completed 100% satisfaction. We had no eliminations reported for true matching pairs and no identifications reported for true non-matching pairs. So no false negatives and no false positives. Inconclusive conclusions are not seen as errors based on our current processes, and they are acceptable conclusions based on the AFTI range of conclusions and the section's SOP. So we do know that the firearms examiners are following the appropriate procedures in these blind cases. And as the results show, not all comparison conclusions are simply either identification or elimination. Again, we don't consider the inconclusives to be errors, but they may instead indicate that the limits of the currently used technology and test methods are not specific or sensitive enough to render a ground truth conclusion in every instance. A multitude of factors may impact the physical evidence, making the decision to identify or eliminate more difficult. Time, damage to the firearm, and brand of ammunition can all affect examination results, excuse me. And while blind cases are intended to mimic actual casework in packaging and offense type, the program does provide a unique opportunity to submit challenging cases that test the examiner's abilities. HFSC has chosen to specifically target challenging case scenarios, like submitting evidence created with two firearms of the same class, in an effort to better define the limitations of analysis. Submitting quote unquote easy comparisons in which examiners are more likely to conclude identification or elimination really wouldn't make these cases that much more distinct from the open proficiency tests. So I do want to go over some limitations of the program as well as this recent study. In the initial stages of the program, when we were just trying to get it off the ground, record keeping and submission rates were inconsistent until the process became more comfortable. Which firearm was used to create the evidence was not consistently recorded, leaving some gaps in understanding if the fired evidence was created using a firearm that was known to produce robust or indistinct marks. So, for example, we couldn't say, oh, that inconclusive result is not surprising because the firearm used to create it doesn't leave good marks or something like that. We don't have a great understanding of that for a lot of our earlier cases. And related to that, while most items have a ground truth of identification or elimination, the manager often has an idea about whether the examiner will conclude ground truth or inconclusive, again, based on clues like knowing whether or not the firearm leaves distinct marks. Unfortunately, this expectation was not always recorded or not consistently recorded, again, making it difficult to determine for certain the reason so many comparisons were determined to be inconclusive. Over time, and especially since going through the data, like we have for this publication, our record keeping has improved. Potentially inconclusive items will be documented in some way to better evaluate any future data. And resource availability is also a limitation for us. The most easily accessible source of firearms that can be used to create fired evidence is HFSC's reference collection. But again, we can't submit those firearms as items of evidence. Similarly to using staff personally owned firearms, we can use them to create fired evidence, but we can't submit those firearms. The partnership with HPD, with the property room allowing us to use guns slated for destruction, is a relatively new development, or has become more streamlined in recent months. And that really, it expands our resources as far as being able to submit guns, but the Houston Police Department has limitations on which guns we can have. And then we ourselves put further limitations on which guns we would like to use, based on whether or not we think the guns are, but we again rely on the firearms manager to help us decide if the guns on the destroy list are guns that would be seen in routine casework. So the pool is limited in diversity and quantity overall, but it's still great to have the HPD resource to help make our cases look just a little bit more like real casework. Despite some of these limitations, the blind program does provide a more controlled environment in which we can examine inconclusive results in known ground truth comparisons. Because the program is an extension of proficiency tests, the section can more fully gauge processes in areas that PTs don't always cover. For example, firearms PTs are often only cartridge cases or only bullets, but blind test cases can include both, as well as fragments and a firearm. And sometimes to make it even more realistic, we'll throw in some dirt or some cotton fibers or some drywall in there to make it look as if it came from some sort of crime scene. Excuse me. So blind cases have the potential to test caliber determinations and trigger pull measurements as well, which are areas that are within our scope of accreditation, but aren't areas which proficiency tests typically assess. And compared with proficiency tests, more challenging case scenarios can be created to test the examiner's thresholds for conclusions. Since blind cases mimic routine casework in packaging and submission, they can more accurately monitor how the section's processes and procedures are operating. Measuring the entire workflow could help identify bottlenecks or areas for improvement. And the blind program has provided us with that in a few of the other sections, not yet in firearms, but the potential is there. And lastly, the blind program gives the examiners the opportunity to bolster their credibility in court when testifying to real cases. Examiners get asked about accreditation and proficiency testing pretty consistently, as far as I know, and I know that occasionally they get asked about the blind testing program. And now the firearms section has their own little resource that they can throw out during testimony to talk about some of their results. So the study really allowed us to look deeply at the program in firearms for the first time, and we identified a multitude of work that we'd like to look into in the future. One thing that we would really like to do is look at inconclusive rates in real casework and compare those rates to those in the blind program. Unfortunately, the firearms section is mostly paper-based, and gathering that information will take time and patience. It took us quite some time to gather the information for the 51 blind cases, and obviously the section works much more real casework than that. But I do think it would be worthwhile to compare inconclusive rates to see where the blind program stands compared to real casework. Another more immediate thing that we can look at is the blind verification program. 100% of cases and all conclusions are verified by a second examiner. In addition to the routine verification procedures, a limited number of cases are verified blindly. These cases are currently selected by firearms management at a rate of 1 case per month. In these cases, the primary examiner's conclusions are masked from the second examiner, allowing the second examiner to conduct an independent analysis with minimized bias from the primary examiner's conclusions. And then once both examiners are finished with their examinations, they come together and they discuss their conclusions. Anecdotally, we see a rise in consultations with blind verifications. So we can not only look at inconclusive rates in blind verifications, but the consultation rates as well. And I forgot to include it in this presentation, but in the 51 cases that we looked at for the blind program, 2 of them had consultations. So not very many. So it'd be interesting again to look at the consultation rate in the blind verification program. Blind QC cases can be utilized for training new examiners or determining the efficacy of new technology. Because blind cases have a known ground truth, they could be good training tools for incoming examiners. Other sections have used old blind cases for training, and firearms could as well. It's been a little while since they've hired a new firearms examiner, but I know a few have started recently, and we hope that the blind samples can be useful for the training program. HFSC is also in the early stages of exploring the use of a 3D imaging instrument in firearms examination. I believe the section is actually working with other CSAFE researchers to get a 3D instrument online. So we're really looking forward to seeing what happens with that. The hope is that 3D imaging may make visible previously imperceptible details, which can be usable data points in comparisons, potentially assisting with inconclusive decisions. And we have known ground truth samples, again, that could be used in this project if that's the direction that they would like to take. And as mentioned earlier, we never had a research question in mind when the blind program was first implemented, but I think that could change now. To get it up and running was a feat of its own, but now that we've taken the time to look at the program closely, we've realized the firearms community could benefit from a more focused and narrow experimental design. For example, formal research on the ability of firearms to leave distinct marks on bullets and cartridge cases could be used in court when testifying to inconclusive results. Deliberately creating and submitting evidence from firearms that do not mark well could be an advantageous route for the blind program to take next, and may help fill in some of the gaps that we had in analyzing this preliminary data. And the last thing that I'd like to mention for this slide is that HFSC is always looking to collaborate with other laboratories and researchers. Collaborating with other labs would help us to expand the availability of firearms and ammunition to submit in blind cases. And it would take some work, but eventually we'd love to be able to set up a way to conduct between lab comparisons of blind tests. That's one great advantage of proficiency tests, but we don't quite have that opportunity with the blind testing. And we would like to. Collaborating with researchers would help us to study the rates of inconclusive decisions and some more of the reasons that inconclusives are so prevalent. Our hope is that further studies can address criticisms aimed at inconclusive decisions and determine whether new technologies like 3D imaging can assist with inconclusive decisions. So if you have any collaboration ideas or anything you would like to see us talk about in relation to our blind testing program, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to work with other labs and researchers. And with that, I just wanted to round out the presentation with these 2 resources. Most of the information used in this presentation has been published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in these 2 articles. Both articles are open access and available to anyone to read, or you can send me an email and I'd be happy to share them with you. The first article, which was actually published more recently, discusses the blind program in the firearms section specifically. It goes into more technical detail than this presentation did, so we invite you to check that out. The firearms manager is a co-author, and she was really integral in making sure we were writing with the appropriate technical vocabulary, and she helped explain some of the nuances of firearms examination. Unfortunately, we do have an erratum in the works to correct some misinterpretation of the data, but everything in this presentation is up to date. If you have read this presentation, it's table 6, where we talk about using two firearms of the same class is not statistically significant. Relooking at the data, we did find that it was statistically significant. So keep that in mind when you read the article. The second publication, which was actually published in 2019, is about the blind program in general and outlines how the program is implemented in each section. We call this the general paper, the blind general paper, and it's more of a background paper than a technical paper, but we think it's a good starting place if you're looking for information on how to start blind testing in your own laboratory. Each laboratory is going to be very different and has its own hurdles to overcome, but we really hope that this is sort of a brainstorming resource for laboratories. So please check those out. We're really quite proud of both of them, despite the erratum that we need to publish soon. And that's all I have for now. I want to say a quick thank you to my co-authors of those articles, HFSC's evidence technicians, HPD's property room, and the firearms section, who all make the program as successful as it is. And thank you to CSAFE for having me. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to attend this presentation. And I will do my best to answer any questions now.
Thank you, Maddie. I see one comment at least from Chris, who says, in quote, inconclusive, that should be an elimination is hugely problematic, since it should be exculpatory evidence for a criminal defendant. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I would also take this opportunity to encourage anyone who has questions or thoughts to put them in the Q&A for Maddie to respond.
I mean, I don't know that I am the appropriate person to speak to that. I just facilitate this program, and I'm slowly learning the implications of inconclusive results. But from a quality standpoint, we can't fault the examiners for determining that they don't have enough information to determine an identification or an elimination. So I'm sorry, that doesn't really answer your question, but that's where I'm at with my skill level there.
Maddie, Chris has posed another thought or a question, and he says, perhaps it's outside the area of expertise, but I have trouble understanding how evidence is suitable for comparison and then inconclusive results.
I guess, I mean, they compared it to other items of evidence. And in some instances, they might be able to ID it to another item, but it's inconclusive to a second item. So it's not, I am failing miserably at trying to explain this. It's kind of item to item dependent as far as my understanding, but they've still done the comparison, and it's a comparison conclusion based on the APTI range of conclusions and the firearms SOPs. They've just determined that there's not enough information there to make a definitive ID or elimination conclusion.
Maddie, another individual said, can you please explain gunshot residue examination?
I cannot. That's not something that we do at HFSC. I think that falls under trace, and we don't have a trace section. If there's anything more specific, let me know. We don't, we certainly don't submit any blind cases that have to do with gunshot residue.
Chris has chimed in on your previous comment that perhaps those categories ought to be combined. I just wanted to make sure that was mentioned before we got too far into the rest of these. Okay. Robin asks, have there been, well, first of all, she thanks you. And then thanks, she Robin. Says, have there been changes in the types of, she says, P-blind cases you submit over time, other than the ability to use HPD firearms?
That's a good question. We do try to keep up with what the section is seeing in routine casework. And in general, the program is fluid in order to try to do that. I can't think of any specific examples, except that when we are looking at the HPD destroy list, oftentimes the cases, the guns are from old cases, since they're ready to be destroyed, and the firearms might not always be something that's like popularly used in Houston anymore. So one of the things we do have to do is kind of keep up with the common firearms used. But that's the only thing I can think of, but I'll definitely let you know if I think of anything else.
I'm going to go back again to the comments made in response to Chris's questions. I think Melissa Nally is responding to this.
Thanks,
she
Melissa.
indicates there are many scenarios, for example, when fragments are damaged and only contain minimal individual characteristics, where inconclusive is the appropriate conclusion. And then Chris also thanks you for the presentation and also thanks HFSC for doing this important work. We do have one more question, it looks like, at least at this time. And they are wondering if there are any plans in the works to do more than one test per month in the future.
I think it would be good. I think it would depend a little bit on qualities availability, the firearms manager's availability to create our test cases for us. Right now, I know that the firearms section has had a few examiners leave, and they've actually had a few examiners come in. So some of them are in training, but maybe as the productivity increases in the section, that 5% goal will change just a little bit, and we'll be able to submit more cases. There's a multitude of factors that'll go into it. I think the section is not very big. I think it's the same examiners that were in this study are basically the same examiners currently. There are 11, not including the ones in training. Maybe there are 10 now and 1 in training that I know of. So again, I think it depends on the productivity of the section and the availability of the quality division and the firearms manager, but we would love to.
Do you know how much time was devoted to the blind cases over the years by those examiners?
Oh, the examiners conducting the casework, that's interesting. I don't personally have a gauge on how much time they spend. I should have included the average number of items in each case. And I'm trying to remember, we put that in the paper, but we don't make them very big. I know that some of the real casework they can get from HPD is quite burdensome, and we try not to do that. We don't submit, 100 items in a case. It's usually just a handful. But that would be interesting to look at. Thank you. That's a great idea. I don't have a gauge just off the top of my head. I didn't get a chance. I did want to thank Chris for his comments, and I apologize that it is just a little outside of my expertise, and thank Melissa for jumping in a little bit.
Just for my curiosity, are the cases assigned randomly or both your cases and what I'll call real casework? Are they assigned randomly, or do people get to pick them up as they see them hit a screen and say, ooh, that one looks easy, I'd like to take it?
That's a good question. My understanding is that they are assigned randomly. I think the supervisor assigns them. I don't know if they just see the cases and pick up the next one. If we have a firearms examiner on the call, they can probably answer that more specifically. We kind of rely on the supervisor for that.
Melissa Nally did just chime in and say they are assigned randomly.
Thanks, Melissa.
Maddie, I want to thank you for taking the time to put all this together and present it to us. answering questions, even when they may be outside your purview. We appreciate that. And folks are chiming in the Q&A, thanking you as well. As always, thank you to all of you who attended today. You truly are the reason that we're here. So we appreciate you showing up. Even more thanks coming in for you, Maddie.
Thanks, everyone.
With that, I'm going to close out and say thank you all. We hope you have a great day.